You know what I think is interesting? Take someone like Jimmy Carr, okay?
Right.
Who's built his whole career on being offensive.
Very annoying laugh, we'll say.
Yes, very
So
bad laugh
irritating.
for somebody who's in comedy. It's so bad, isn't it? It's like a dying seal,
Sorry, Jimmy. I know he's a listener.
clearly. Anyway, controversial guy has built his whole career on offensive humour. But then he gets caught not paying taxes, and that's gone too far. You can make a dead baby joke, hilarious. Don't pay your taxes, not cool.
Oh, yeah. No, there's something about tax avoidance, isn't there, where it's either, it really splits people. People either think, it's your right, or they think you're depriving the NHS of money. It really tugs on their heartstrings.
Even Gary Barlow, the public called for him to have his OBE pulled.
Yeah. But Ken Dodd, marries his wife on his deathbed. We love it.
I'm Lauren Davidson, Head of Personal Finance at The Telegraph.
And I'm Sam Meadows, a personal finance reporter.
And this is Moral Money, the podcast in which we rope in top Telegraph columnists to sort out your financial issues, from tax avoidance to tipping. We can't tell you how to make your first million, but we can tell you when to speak up when you think you're being cheated out of money.
So, if you're annoyed that your mate never gets a round in at the pub, or maybe you're frustrated with your children because they keep blowing their allowance on pointless rubbish, this is the podcast for you. And today, we're joined by a columnist who went from identifying as a Marxist in the 60s to being one of the country's foremost conservative commentators. She's a political columnist for The Telegraph. It's Janet Daley.
Janet, welcome to Moral Money.
Thank you so much.
So what is your approach like to money these days?
Well, for the first time in my adult life, single and married, I actually don't have to worry about money. I'm no longer in debt after years of sort of raising a family, paying off a mortgage, being constantly worried and anxious about paying off debts. My husband and I are finally free of that because our children have gone, they're adults, and we no longer have the kind of responsibilities for providing for them, paying for education and financing them into young adulthood. So it's quite startling.
Living the dream.
Sounds absolutely lovely. I wish my life was a bit more like that. And that brings us on nicely to our first question, which is on the theme of intergenerational finances, but in the form of inheritance. So this one, a reader writes, "My divorced father, who is in his late 60s, is spending huge amounts on holidays, luxuries, and generally living the high life. I worry there will be little left for me in my inheritance. I'm 35 and I feel that my father's generation had it easier when it came to making and saving money. Can I ask him to be more thrifty?"
I find it extraordinary that this young man, relatively young man, is referring to this as his inheritance. It's his potential inheritance. At the moment, so long as his father is alive, it's his father's life savings. Now, I would feel, and I do feel, under some moral obligation or moral inclination, I should say, to leave an inheritance to my children and grandchildren. But I would find it extraordinary if they told me off for spending money that was rightfully theirs. This money, legally and morally, I think, belongs to his father, who I assume, we don't know the details of this case, but I assume that his father spent much of his early life providing for this son and perhaps other siblings, may have paid his way through education, certainly clothed and fed him during his childhood and adolescence, perhaps even young adulthood. Right. And now he seems to lay claim to the rest to what is left of that money. And I do find that ethically very peculiar.
One thing he points to in particular is that his father's generation had it easier. So his father found it easier to earn more money, buy a property earlier, get on the ladder, which his generation has not had. I mean, has that been your experience?
The only aspect of that with which I agree is that it was cheaper, not necessarily easier, but cheaper to buy property when we were younger. I mean, we did buy houses that were, in real terms, less expensive than the houses that my children are having to buy now. But the relative wealth that we had was also much less. I mean, my adult children are much better off than we were, my husband and I were, at their stage of life. And they do have to pay humongous mortgage payments. That's absolutely true. And that is the one terrific advantage that our generation did have. But that was all relative. The younger people in their 30s and 40s now, for the most part, seem to expect to have cars, expect to have centrally heated homes, expect to have electronic goods that we would never have dreamt of course. But we struggled. I can remember feeling that I had died and gone to heaven when I got a tumble dryer. Our lives materially were considerably less comfortable and affluent, and we were in debt all of our lives until really the children were finished with their university education. That was only that was just the first stage in which we were free of both mortgage and overdraft debt. And I don't really see us as an enormously privileged generation, except in the sense that property was cheaper and more plentiful.
And the easier it is to buy property, I mean, then you've benefited from the astronomical rises in property prices.
Yes,
of course.
Which
only on
people
paper.
who buy today.
Only on paper. Only, I mean, if it's true that, if we cashed in our chips in property and lived in a tent, there would be an extraordinary amount of money. But if we wanted to downsize, the expense of that would be phenomenal. We would be involved in stamp duty and the costs of property changing. One of the reasons that people are not selling on and downsizing in the way that everybody apparently would like us to is because it is phenomenally expensive, and it's very, very difficult to think what you would even do, for example, with the amount of money that you freed from your property. How could you invest it in a way that would be worth anything like the amount of money that's worth invested in a house?
Lots of the readers who, as always, this piece has been online before on the Telegraph website, and some of the readers do agree with you.
Yeah.
One here says she was married 18 months before they even had a fridge. And,
yes, absolutely.
And when they bought one, it was small.
Yeah, it was commonplace not to have fridges, not to have telephones. The kind of creature comforts that the generation of young married people are accustomed to now was way beyond the expectations of our generation.
Is there a line for you here? Because there is in this question, it does say that they're spending huge amounts on holidays, luxuries, living the high life. Is there a line for you where, if he's going on a cruise every other month or every month, is there a line where you can bring it up and say stop, or is it just...
I personally wouldn't make that choice. I mean, but it's a question of who this money belongs to, who it morally belongs to. This man, presumably, he's now in his late 60s, presumably he's retired, he's divorced, presumably he spent most of his adult life working and providing for a family. And we don't know how many siblings there were or what the marital circumstances were, but he is now, probably for the first time in his life, free to indulge himself, to get some personal pleasure. Maybe that's selfish. I wouldn't do it like that, but to say that it's morally wrong to do it and that accumulated savings should now be kept for the sons or daughters or grandchildren or whatever, whom he provided for all those years in his working life, I find that very peculiar.
Why wouldn't you do it like that? Is it because you're thinking about your passing on to your children?
And partly
or
just because I'd be disinclined to. I mean, it's just not my scene, my idea of a cruise is my personal idea of hell, and I would not want to go on multiple holidays. We have a home that we have lived in for many years and which we're very comfortable with, and I prefer to stay in that home and I prefer to go on working. So it's not it's really partly just a question of my own inclination. But I also do think in terms, for example, if for some reason we had to think of equity releasing part of the value of the house, I would certainly feel that I had to tell the children that.
Right.
And I would say, I'm very sorry, we have to do this because it is going to affect your inheritance. But, nonetheless, we did spend years struggling. And as far as we are concerned, it is our money, but we fully intend to leave as much of it as we possibly can.
Well, on that point, Janet, can I ask you, because one reader in the comments did point out that if the father does intend to leave any money to the son, he will have to pay inheritance tax on it.
Yes.
So actually, it's quite good planning to start giving his son some of it now, because he's young. He's only 65, this retiree. He could have decades ahead of him. And
yes, that's true.
So should he start funneling a little bit of money now?
Oh,
it's good tax planning.
I can't possibly say that. I mean, I personally do help the children now and give money to them when they, for home improvements or whatever. Right. But that really is a very personal decision. And it's also a question of how much this son is earning himself and how much he should expect expect to be, no one helped us when we were younger. It was part of grown-up life that you expected to be self-reliant. If it's impossible for him to be self-reliant, or there is some sort of family emergency, or, help is really urgently needed, yes, then I think you are morally obliged to help. These are still your children, however old they are. But and I think it also does make sense to give some of the money that they might inherit before you die, hopefully 7 years before you die, so that they don't end up paying inheritance tax on it. But that's something that is so difficult to predict.
Of course. Yeah. So perhaps a good way to sum up this is a reader comment from Paul Southworth, who simply says to this reader, "Damn cheek."
Yes, absolutely, I must say.
We're going to take a quick break now, but stay with us, because after that, Janet will be discussing her favourite topic, the ethics of tax avoidance.
Hello, podcast listeners. I'm Charlie Gowans-Eglinton, the Telegraph's senior fashion editor and host of the Fashion Unzipped podcast. Every other week, I sit down with some of the biggest names making waves in the fashion industry, from Trinny Woodall to Instagram's Eva Chen to Samantha Cameron. And I drag our team of fashion experts here at the Telegraph into the studio to tell you all about our favourite trends, the talking points of the moment, and our view from the front row. We can't dress you every morning. It's just not really how podcasts work, but we can give you half an hour of inspiration every other Thursday. Just search Fashion Unzipped wherever you download your podcasts. Welcome back, where we're joined this week by Janet Daley, and onto one of her favourite topics, tax avoidance. So a reader writes in, "My husband owns and operates a relatively large portfolio of buy-to-let properties. I take no role in running the business and I work full-time, but he's recently decided to restructure the company, moving several of the houses into my name in order to save on the tax bill. This makes me uncomfortable, as the earnings are a result of his work and not mine. The arrangement is all legal, but I feel we should pay our fair share of tax to support the vital public services. He says it's within the law, and why should we pay more than we need to?" Janet, you're nodding away. What do you think about that?
I'm very exercised about this slide regarding tax avoidance as somehow a criminal form of activity like tax evasion. Tax evasion is a crime. Tax avoidance is what happens when you invest in an ISA. There are lots of tax avoidance schemes that are not only perfectly legal, but that are encouraged by the government. And I don't like the idea that the government should fudge the distinction. It's not for the government to say what is moral and what is immoral. That's for totalitarian societies, not democratic ones. If you think something is really wrong and deleterious to the country's economic future, make it illegal. But don't have this confusing, to some extent, we're praised for doing things that are tax avoidance, investing in certain kinds of pension schemes, investing in ISAs, investing in things that are not, don't have a tax liability. All as an encouragement to save. So how come if you avoid tax in that way, that's morally acceptable, but if you avoid tax in a rather perhaps cleverer way, or manipulating your finances, if it's legal, it's legal. And nobody, you personally may decide that you would rather pay more tax, oddly enough, but it's not for any government to assume the kind of moral authority to say that something that is legal is somehow socially or morally unacceptable.
I think you're absolutely right, Janet, and there obviously is a clear distinction between tax evasion, which is illegal, and tax avoidance, which is just clever tax planning. But when you hear of these stories of celebrities who move their money offshore and various other places in ways that is legal and is constituted as tax avoidance, there's huge public outcry about that these wealthy people should be contributing.
Then make it illegal. Make it illegal. If you're going to have tax avoidance schemes that involve taking money out of the country, make it illegal, straightforwardly. The point is, you go to an accountant to maximize your income, and that's called, as you say, financial planning. And you could actually, I think, have grounds for suing your accountant if he didn't tell you all the possible ways in which you could pay the least tax. That's what he's for. That's what he's paid to do, and that's perfectly legitimate. If you're going to say that something is so unacceptable and so damaging to the economic future of the country, make it illegal. But don't suddenly say to somebody who has got perfectly legitimate, if perhaps overly clever, financial advice and done what his accountant tells him to do, don't suddenly tell him that he's committed a crime and stick him with an enormous fine. You can't retrospectively decide that something is criminal and that somebody is going to be fined for doing something that his accountant quite legitimately told told him was legal.
Outside of the question of fines, of course, taxes do pay for our public services,
Sure.
police officers, teachers, schools, streetlights.
NHS.
Do you think, NHS, of course, do you think there's ever is there a moral obligation to pay tax?
Sure.
Is it a moral question?
Sure, of course it is. But legality and morality are two different things, and it's very dangerous to confound them. I mean, most people don't think that adultery is illegal or should be illegal, although many people think it's immoral. And conversely, most people think that parking on a double yellow line is illegal, but most people don't think it's immoral. There is a real distinction between something that's moral and something that's legal. And the government has to be very clear about this. Otherwise, you slide in, first of all, to a kind of dangerous ambiguity about what people are obliged to do, and a really totalitarian view of government where it can decide that ethical principles are enforceable by law.
But this here is our reader saying, I feel uncomfortable about this and I feel like we should structure our affairs.
Don't do it.
You Right, you do appreciate her view.
Of course. And I wouldn't do it either. But that's not the point. I mean, we're talking about the difference between evasion and avoidance, and that is a very serious distinction.
So tax avoidance is like sleeping around outside of marriage. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, you wouldn't want somebody arrested for it, would you? I mean,
no, exactly.
They do that in some societies, but not democratic free societies. I mean, if you decide that certain species of tax avoidance should be against the law, then make them against the law. Legislate and make them against the law. But it should be clear and unambiguous what the law is and what is illegal.
Sure, and especially in this case, the government does set out tax laws that allow married people to share their tax affairs.
Yes.
They allow them to pass income tax thresholds to each other, which is actually quite underused. There are, the government encourages these kinds of financial planning.
And you have to bear in mind too, I mean, just, this is, playing devil's advocate here. There was a time when women fought for the right. To be separately taxed, individually taxed, and to take individual fiscal responsibility within the household so that some things were theirs and some things weren't, and separate bank accounts and, separate mortgages and all of that. And she seems to be implying that she is against having separate ownership of these properties because it constitutes tax avoidance. But there is a bigger issue here about married women. And their separateness for tax and financial purposes from their husbands.
On a purely moral basis, right? So we've got, on the one hand, we've got the husband who wants to limit his tax bill as much as possible. And we've got the wife who wants to pay more tax. Forget the legality. On a purely moral basis, who's right there?
Oh, it's impossible to say. It depends entirely on your moral presuppositions. I personally think that you should pay, of course you should pay a fair contribution to the public services, but what is a fair contribution? That in itself is a moral question.
Course.
And if you get to the point where you're taxing people so heavily that it's a disincentive to work, for example, is that morally acceptable? And also the politicians spending money, which is what taxation allows for, is that inherently more morally desirable than individuals spending money? I mean, if you ask most people whether politicians are morally superior beings and their decisions about how to spend money are inherently better than private individuals, they'll all say no. So why is it better for governments to confiscate people's wealth and spend it than for individuals to make those decisions? That's a big, big moral question. So to say, is it morally better to pay more tax is there's a much bigger arena in which that has to be discussed.
And presumably nobody voluntarily pays more tax. No one says, you want to tax me at 20% of my income, I'll give you 30.
I wouldn't have thought so.
You can return your winter fuel allowance, of course.
You can.
There you go.
I give mine to my children.
Which brings us roundly back. Thank you so much, Janet, for joining us today. We've really enjoyed that chat. I'm glad to know that you think that not paying your taxes is like cheating on your husband.
Thank you. That was very good fun.
Thank you so much for listening.
We always love to hear what you think. Here's what some listeners thought about last week's episode, when Tim Stanley advised a reader who gave a hefty charity donation for a marathon that was never run.
The only fair solution is he needs to complete a race. That way, everybody has done exactly what they said they were going to do, and I think he should probably pay for the entry out of his own pocket.
Hello, this is Izzy. What I would say to this questioner is, it's for charity. Suck it up and just pay the money.
Hi, I'm Adam. I think that your nephew's been very unfair in this situation. It's obviously too difficult to ask for the charity to give the money back, so I would suggest that you ask your nephew to give a donation to a charity of your choice. That way it balances out and charity wins at the end of the day.
And have your say on this week's episode, or maybe you have your own burning moral money conundrum you want to put to our experts. Do get in touch. The email address is moralmoney@telegraph.co.uk, or you can give us a call and leave a voicemail to hear your own voice on next week's show. The number is 07867 162 170, and that will also be in the show notes to this week's episode.
And of course, if you've not yet subscribed, please do. And if you're enjoying the podcast, why not tell a friend about it? Maybe you know someone who's worrying about their own inheritance and would like some advice. Drop them a link.
And if you do like the podcast, don't forget to leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts, and come back next week when we will be talking to Bryony Gordon, who's got some very strong views on what to do if your flatmate's boyfriend has moved in but isn't paying rent, and when you can ask your meddling parents to take a step back.
Sounds juicy. Bye.
Bye. It's like the end of Playdays. Bye.